Girl sobs, quietly, every morning on the bus. One day, the driver peeks below her seat and can't believe it. The yellow school bus lurched to a stop on Maple Street, its brakes hissing like an old steam engine. Harold Hank Peterson had been driving this same route through the suburbs of Cedar Falls, Minnesota, for 18 years, and he knew every pothole, every stop sign, and every child who climbed aboard his bus. The October morning was crisp, with frost still clinging to the edges of the windshield, despite the early sun's efforts to melt it away. Hank adjusted his rearview mirror and watched as the familiar parade of backpack-laden students shuffled toward the bus. Tommy Rodriguez bounced up the steps first, his hockey stick poking out of his oversized sports bag. Sarah Chen followed, earbuds already in, lost in whatever music teenagers listen to these days. Then came the Williamson twins, arguing about something in their rapid-fire way that made Hank smile despite himself. But it was the last student who caught his attention, just as she had every morning for the past 3 weeks. Emily Crawford, a slight girl with auburn hair that hung like a curtain around her pale face, climbed the steps with the careful deliberation of someone much older than her 12 years. She never looked up at him, never offered the shy smile or mumbled "good morning" that most of the kids managed. Instead, she would slide into the third seat on the right side, always the same spot, and press herself against the window as if she were trying to disappear into the glass itself. "Morning, Emily," Hank said gently, as he did every day. She didn't respond, just clutched her worn backpack tighter and settled into her seat. Through the large mirror mounted above his head, Hank could see her reflection clearly. Her shoulders were hunched, her head down, and even from this distance, he could see the telltale shimmer of tears on her cheeks. The bus filled with the usual morning chaos. Kids shouted across the aisles, sharing weekend stories and complaining about upcoming tests. The Hendricks boy was showing off his new phone to anyone who would look. Maria Santos was frantically trying to finish her math homework, her pencil scratching against the paper balanced on her textbook. It was the same routine Hank had witnessed thousands of times before, the comfortable predictability of childhood routines. But Emily Crawford sat in her bubble of silence, untouched by the energy swirling around her. Hank had noticed her tears on the very first day she'd ridden his bus, 3 weeks ago when the school year was still new and most kids were excited about seeing their friends again. At first, he'd assumed it was typical new school jitters. Cedar Falls Elementary had just completed a district rezoning, and several students had been transferred from other schools. Adjustment was normal, yet as the days passed, Emily's tears hadn't stopped. If anything, they seemed to be getting worse. This morning, Hank could hear the soft hiccuping sounds of her trying to cry quietly, the kind of restrained weeping that spoke of someone who had learned to keep their pain hidden. It broke his heart. Hank had raised 3 daughters of his own, and he'd driven school buses long enough to recognize the signs when a child was struggling. He'd seen it all. Kids dealing with divorce, family financial troubles, bullying, learning disabilities, and worse. Most of the time, a kind word, a patient ear, or a gentle conversation was enough to help. Sometimes he'd need to involve the school counselor or make a phone call home. But Emily was different. She seemed almost afraid, not just sad. He'd tried approaching her gently several times. Last week he'd offered her a piece of gum, thinking it might open a conversation. She'd shaken her head rapidly and pressed herself further into the corner of her seat. When he'd asked if she was okay, she'd nodded once but kept her face turned away. Yesterday he'd tried asking about her classes, whether she was liking her new school, if she'd made any friends. Each question had been met with the same response, a barely perceptible nod or shake of her head, and then more tears. The other kids seemed to have given up trying to include her. At first, some of the girls had attempted to start conversations, but Emily's lack of response had eventually discouraged them. Now they left her alone, not out of meanness, but because they'd learned she didn't want to talk. Children were surprisingly good at reading social cues, even when they didn't fully understand them. As the bus pulled away from the curb and began its familiar route towards Cedar Falls Elementary, Hank found himself glancing in the mirror more frequently than usual. Emily was crying again, her small shoulders shaking with the effort of keeping her sobs silent. Her backpack was clutched in her lap like a shield, and she was rocking slightly back and forth, a self-soothing motion that reminded Hank uncomfortably of his youngest daughter when she'd been frightened during thunderstorms. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the bus's interior. Most of the seats were filled now, with the comfortable chatter of kids who'd known each other for years. The Kowalski girl was braiding her friend's hair. The Murphy boy was trading Pokemon cards with his seatmate. Everything was normal, routine, safe. Everything except for the crying girl in the third seat. Hank made a mental note to speak with Mrs. Rodriguez, the school counselor, when they arrived at school. He'd been debating whether to get involved for weeks now, but Emily's distress was becoming impossible to ignore. As a bus driver, he was technically just responsible for getting the kids safely to and from school, but 18 years of driving had taught him that sometimes safely meant more than just avoiding traffic accidents. The bus rounded the corner onto Elm Street, and Hank automatically slowed for the speed bump near the community center. In his mirror, he saw Emily wipe her eyes with the back of her sleeve, trying to compose herself as they got closer to school. It was a pattern he'd noticed. The tears would start as soon as she got on the bus and continue for most of the ride. But as they approached the school, she'd make an effort to pull herself together. What was she afraid of? What was making this child so desperately unhappy? And why did she seem so alone in her pain? The bus pulled into the circular drive at Cedar Falls Elementary, joining the line of other buses discharging their passengers. Hank engaged the parking brake and opened the door, watching as kids began to file out. Emily was always among the last to leave, waiting until the bus was nearly empty before she stood up. She would walk to the front with her head down, her backpack clutched tight, and disappear into the crowd of students heading toward the school building. Today was no different. As Emily approached the front of the bus, Hank tried once more. "Emily, honey, are you sure you're okay? If you need to talk to someone..." She looked up at him then, just for a moment, and Hank was struck by the depth of fear in her brown eyes. It wasn't the normal anxiety of a shy child, or even the sadness of someone adjusting to a new school. This was something deeper, more troubling. Before he could say anything else, she was off the bus and walking quickly toward the school entrance, her small figure swallowed up by the crowd of other students. Hank sat in his driver's seat for a moment longer than usual, watching until Emily disappeared through the school's front doors. He had a feeling that whatever was troubling this little girl was bigger than typical childhood problems, and he was determined to find out what it was. The next morning brought the same routine, but Hank Peterson was paying closer attention than ever before. He'd spent the previous evening thinking about Emily Crawford, even mentioning her to his wife Margaret over dinner. Margaret, who had worked as a nurse at the county hospital for over 20 years, had seen her share of troubled children. Her advice had been simple but firm. "Trust your instincts, Hank. If something feels wrong, it probably is." As the bus made its way through the suburban streets of Cedar Falls, Hank found himself studying his passengers more carefully. The morning air was colder today, with a hint of the harsh Minnesota winter that would arrive all too soon. The trees lining the residential streets were beginning to turn, their leaves painted in brilliant shades of red and gold that would be gone within weeks. Emily was the fifth stop on his route, and Hank felt his anxiety building as they approached Maple Street. He'd called the school the previous afternoon and spoken with Mrs. Rodriguez, the guidance counselor, about his concerns. She'd been grateful for his call and had promised to keep a closer eye on Emily, but she'd also mentioned that the girl was equally quiet and withdrawn in class. Her teachers described her as a good student who completed her work but rarely spoke or participated in group activities. "She seems frightened of something," Mrs. Rodriguez had said during their phone conversation. "I've tried talking to her several times, but she just shuts down. I called her home number twice, but it goes straight to voicemail and no one has returned my calls." This information had troubled Hank throughout the night. In his experience, parents who were difficult to reach often had their own problems that trickled down to their children. He'd seen it before. Kids who carried adult burdens, who learned to be invisible because visibility brought unwanted attention at home. The bus pulled up to Emily's stop, and Hank watched through his side mirror as she appeared from around the corner of a small white house with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. She was wearing the same worn jacket she'd had on every day for the past 3 weeks, a faded purple windbreaker that looked too thin for the cooling weather. Her backpack, he noticed, was bulging more than usual today, as if she'd stuffed extra items inside. "Morning, Emily," he said as she climbed aboard, but she didn't acknowledge him. She moved to her usual seat with the same careful precision, sliding across the vinyl and pressing herself against the window. Almost immediately, Hank could see her shoulders begin to shake. As the bus filled with other students, Hank found himself listening more carefully to the conversations around him. He'd always been good at multitasking, keeping his eyes on the road while monitoring the behavior of his passengers, But today, he was paying particular attention to any mention of Emily or her family. "Did you guys see the new Batman movie?" Tommy Rodriguez was asking his seatmate. "My dad took me last weekend. It was awesome." "I want to see it," replied Jake Morrison. "My mum said maybe this weekend if I finish my science project." Normal kid conversations, normal problems, normal lives. But from the third seat came only the sound of muffled crying. Hank had driven this route long enough to know most of the families in the neighborhood, at least by sight. He'd seen parents waiting at bus stops, waving goodbye to their children, chatting with neighbors. But he'd never seen Emily with a parent or guardian. She always appeared alone, walking from the direction of the White House, but never with anyone accompanying her to the bus stop. As they approached the school, Hank made a decision. Instead of his usual route through the main streets, he took a slight detour that would add an extra 5 minutes to the trip. He announced to the kids that there was construction ahead and they'd need to take the long way around. Most of them didn't care. A few extra minutes on the bus meant a few less minutes in first period. The detour gave him time to observe Emily more closely. In his rearview mirror, he could see her more clearly than usual. Her tears weren't just sadness. There was a quality to her crying that spoke of genuine fear. She kept glancing toward the back of the bus, as if she was afraid someone might be watching her. Her hands were clenched so tightly around her backpack that her knuckles were white. More troubling was what he noticed about her physical appearance. The jacket she wore every day wasn't just old, it was dirty, as if it hadn't been washed in weeks. Her hair, while clean, was poorly cut, with uneven layers that suggested someone had trimmed it at home rather than at a salon. And there was something about the way she held herself, a hypervigilance that reminded Hank of wounded animals he'd seen during his brief stint as a hunter in his younger years. When they finally reached the school, Emily waited for the bus to completely empty before standing up. This was her pattern, but today Hank noticed something different. As she gathered her things, she looked around the seat area carefully, as if checking to make sure she hadn't left anything behind. It was the behavior of someone who couldn't afford to lose anything, someone for whom every possession was precious. "Emily," Hank said gently as she approached the front of the bus, "I want you to know that if you ever need help, or if you want to talk about anything, I'm here, okay?" She paused at the top of the steps, her hand gripping the metal rail. For a moment, Hank thought she might actually respond. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she were about to say something, but then she seemed to think better of it. She nodded once, quickly, and hurried off the bus. Hank watched her walk toward the school building, noting how she kept her head down and avoided eye contact with other students. She moved with purpose, as if she had learned that drawing attention to herself was dangerous. When she reached the entrance, she disappeared inside without looking back. The morning routine continued as Hank drove the empty bus back to the transportation depot. His route wouldn't begin again until dismissal time, which gave him several hours to think about what he'd observed. He'd been driving school buses for 18 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts about children in trouble. Emily Crawford was definitely in trouble, but he was beginning to suspect it was worse than he'd initially thought. During his lunch break, Hank decided to drive by Emily's neighborhood. He told himself he was just curious about the area, but he knew he was really hoping to learn something that might help him understand what was happening with the girl. Maple Street was a working-class area of Cedar Falls, with small houses that had been built in the 1960s and 1970s. Most were well-maintained, with tidy yards and signs of families who took pride in their homes. The White House where Emily lived was different. The yard was overgrown, with weeds choking out what had once been a flower bed. The paint was peeling badly, and one of the shutters hung at an odd angle. There was an old car in the driveway, a sedan that looked like it hadn't run in months. The overall impression was one of neglect, of a place where no one had the time, money, or energy to maintain basic upkeep. More concerning was the fact that all the windows were covered with heavy curtains or blinds, even during the middle of the day. The house looked closed off from the world, secretive. Hank had driven by hundreds of houses over the years, and he'd learned to read the signs of homes where children might not be safe. As he drove slowly past, he noticed a figure moving behind one of the front windows. The curtain twitched, as if someone had been watching the street and had quickly moved away when they saw his bus approaching. The movement was furtive, guilty, and it made Hank's stomach tighten with worry. He drove around the block once more, but this time he parked at the corner where he could observe the house without being obvious about it. For 20 minutes, he watched and waited, but saw no other signs of activity. No one came or went. No one checked the mail or tended to the yard. The house sat silent and closed, like a place where secrets were kept. When Hank finally drove away, he was more convinced than ever that Emily Crawford was in serious trouble. The question was what he could do about it, and whether he could find a way to help her before whatever was happening got worse. The following morning brought with it a cold rain that drummed against the windows of the school bus and turned the autumn leaves into a slippery carpet on the streets of Cedar Falls. Hank Peterson had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of Emily Crawford and the closed-up house on Maple Street. He'd even called his eldest daughter Susan, who worked as a social worker in Minneapolis, to ask her advice about signs of child abuse or neglect. "The thing is, Dad," Susan had told him during their long phone conversation, "kids who are being hurt learn to hide it really well. They become experts at being invisible, at not drawing attention to themselves, and sometimes the crying isn't about what's happening to them. It's about what they're afraid might happen." Those words had stuck with Hank throughout the night. What was Emily afraid might happen? The bus route began as usual, with the familiar stops and the same group of chattering students. But as they approached Maple Street, Hank felt his anxiety spike. The rain was coming down harder now, and visibility was reduced. He slowed the bus and engaged the flashers, following proper procedure for weather conditions. Emily appeared from around the corner of the White House, but today she was different. She wasn't just walking, she was running, her thin jacket providing little protection against the rain. Her backpack bounced against her back as she hurried toward the bus stop, and Hank could see that she was soaked through. More troubling, even from a distance, he could see that she was crying harder than usual. "Morning, Emily," he said as she climbed aboard, water dripping from her hair and jacket. "Rough morning." She didn't respond, but for the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were red not just from crying, but from exhaustion, as if she hadn't slept. There was a small bruise on her left cheek, barely visible but definitely there. Hank's heart clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. Emily made her way to her usual seat, but today something was different about her routine. As she sat down, Hank noticed that she was glancing around nervously, as if she was afraid someone might be watching her. Her backpack, which was even more bulging than the day before, was clutched protectively against her chest. The bus filled with other students, but the usual morning chatter was subdued due to the weather. Kids were shaking rain from their jackets and complaining about getting wet. The Williamson twins were arguing about who had forgotten to bring an umbrella. It was the kind of ordinary morning chaos that Hank usually found comforting, but today it felt surreal given what he suspected was happening with Emily. As they drove towards school, Hank found himself checking his mirrors more frequently than usual. Emily was crying, but today her tears seemed different. There was an urgency to her distress, a quality that spoke of immediate fear rather than long-term sadness. She kept reaching into her backpack as if checking to make sure something was still there. About halfway to school, something happened that made Hank's blood run cold. Emily had been rummaging in her backpack when she suddenly froze, her hand still inside the bag. Her eyes went wide with panic, and she began searching more frantically. Whatever she was looking for, she couldn't find it. The look of terror on her face was so intense that Hank almost pulled the bus over. Then, just as suddenly, Emily's expression changed to one of relief. She pulled her hand out of the backpack and pressed it against her chest, as if calming her racing heart. She'd found whatever she was looking for, but the incident had shaken her badly. Hank made a decision. Instead of driving straight to school, he announced to the kids that he needed to make a brief stop at the transportation depot to check something on the bus. It was a lie, but it would give him an excuse to park somewhere safe and maybe have a chance to talk to Emily privately. The depot was only a few blocks from the school, and Hank pulled into the parking lot behind the main building. He told the kids he'd be right back and that they should stay seated. Then he walked to the back of the bus toward Emily's seat. "Emily, honey," he said softly, crouching down beside her seat, "I'm worried about you. Are you okay?" She looked up at him with those haunted brown eyes, and for a moment, Hank thought she might actually tell him what was wrong. Her mouth opened, and he could see her struggling with the decision of whether to speak. But then she seemed to remember something, and her face closed off again. She nodded quickly and turned back toward the window. "Emily, if someone is hurting you, you can tell me. I can help you. Do you understand?" This time her reaction was immediate and frightening. She shook her head violently, her eyes wide with terror. "No," she whispered, the first word Hank had ever heard her speak. "No, no, no." The fear in her voice was so genuine, so raw, that Hank felt his own hands begin to shake. This wasn't a child who was just sad or adjusting to a new school. This was a child who was terrified of something specific, something that the mere mention of getting help had triggered. "Okay," he said gently, backing away slightly. "Okay, Emily. I'm not going to do anything that scares you, but I want you to know that I'm here if you need me." She nodded once quickly and turned back to the window. But Hank noticed that she was holding her backpack even tighter now, as if it contained something precious and fragile that she couldn't afford to lose. The rest of the ride to school passed in silence. When they arrived, Emily waited for the bus to empty as usual, but this time, as she stood up to leave, something fell from beneath her seat. It was small and white, and it fluttered to the floor like a leaf. Emily saw it immediately and dropped to her knees, scrambling to pick it up. But Hank was closer, and he bent down to help her. As his fingers closed around the object, he realized it was a photograph, an old creased picture of a young woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. The woman was holding a baby, and there was something about her eyes that reminded Hank of Emily. "Is this your mum?" he asked gently, holding the photograph out to her. Emily's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She snatched the picture from his hands and clutched it against her chest, tears streaming down her face. "She's gone," she whispered, so quietly that Hank almost didn't hear her. "She's gone and I can't find her." Before Hank could respond, Emily was off the bus and running toward the school building, her backpack bouncing against her back and the photograph pressed safely against her heart. Hank watched her go, his mind racing with new questions and a growing sense of urgency. A missing mother, a terrified child, a house that looked abandoned but wasn't, and a little girl who carried her most precious possessions with her every day, as if she was afraid she might never see them again. For the first time since he'd started driving school buses, Hank Peterson felt like he was in over his head, but he also knew that he couldn't walk away from this. Emily Crawford needed help, whether she could ask for it or not, and he was determined to find a way to give it to her. The revelation about Emily's missing mother haunted Hank Peterson for the rest of the day. As he completed his afternoon route, dropping students off at their various stops, he found himself thinking about the photograph and Emily's whispered words. "She's gone and I can't find her." There was something about the way she'd said it that suggested this wasn't a case of divorce or a parent who had moved away. Emily's terror spoke of something more sinister. That evening, Hank decided to do something he'd never done in his 18 years of driving. He researched one of his passengers. Using his home computer, he began searching for information about the Crawford family, starting with public records and newspaper archives. What he found made his blood run cold. 3 months ago, Jennifer Crawford, a 28-year-old single mother, had been reported missing by her workplace when she failed to show up for her shift at the county hospital where she worked as a nurse. According to the newspaper report, Jennifer had left her daughter with a family friend and never returned. The police had investigated, but with no signs of foul play and no leads, the case had eventually been classified as a voluntary missing person. But Emily was riding his bus, living in that house on Maple Street. Who was taking care of her? And why was she so terrified? Further searching revealed that Jennifer Crawford had no known relatives in the area. Her parents were deceased and she had no siblings. The family friend mentioned in the news report was identified as Robert Henley, a 45-year-old man who worked as a maintenance supervisor at the same hospital where Jennifer had been employed. Hank's hands were shaking as he printed out the articles. Everything was beginning to make sense in the most horrible way possible. Emily wasn't just a sad child adjusting to a new school. She was a child whose mother had vanished, leaving her in the care of someone who might not have her best interests at heart. The next morning, Hank arrived at his bus early and made a point of positioning himself so he could observe Emily's boarding process more carefully. He'd always been a detail-oriented person, but now he was looking for specific signs of abuse or neglect. The bruise on her cheek from the previous day was barely visible now, but he could see the faint yellow-green of healing discoloration. When Emily climbed aboard, Hank noticed something that made his stomach lurch. She was limping slightly, favoring her left leg. It was subtle, the kind of thing that someone might miss if they weren't looking for it, but it was definitely there. "Morning, Emily," he said, keeping his voice as gentle as possible. "How are you feeling today?" She didn't respond, but she looked at him briefly and he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was a child carrying an adult's burden, and it was breaking his heart. As Emily made her way to her seat, Hank noticed that her backpack was even more bulging than before. It looked like she was carrying everything she owned, as if she was prepared to flee at any moment. The sight of it made him think of refugees, of people who had learned to keep their most precious possessions close because they couldn't trust that they'd be safe anywhere else. The bus filled with other students, but today Hank was paying attention to how they interacted with Emily. Most of them ignored her, but a few of the girls occasionally glanced in her direction with expressions of concern. Children were remarkably good at sensing when one of their peers was in distress, even if they didn't know how to help. As they drove toward school, Hank found himself thinking about his conversation with his daughter Susan. She'd given him a list of signs to watch for, and Emily was displaying almost all of them. Social withdrawal, excessive fear, signs of physical abuse, and what Susan had called hypervigilance, the constant state of alertness that came from living in an unpredictable, dangerous environment. About halfway to school, something happened that confirmed Hank's worst fears. Emily had been crying quietly as usual, when she suddenly stiffened and looked toward the back of the bus. Following her gaze, Hank saw that she was staring at Jake Morrison, a harmless 10-year-old who was showing his friend a small toy truck. But Emily was looking at Jake with the same expression of terror that Hank had seen when he'd mentioned getting help. It took him a moment to realize what was happening. Jake was a boy approximately the same age as Emily, and he was holding something in his hands. To Emily, in her current state of hypervigilance, this innocent scene was triggering memories of something much more threatening. Hank made a decision. He caught Jake's eye in the rearview mirror and made a subtle gesture for him to put the toy away. Jake, who was a good kid, complied immediately, not understanding why but recognizing the authority in Hank's request. Almost immediately, Emily's posture relaxed slightly. The incident gave Hank a clearer picture of what Emily might be experiencing at home. She was afraid of men, or at least of certain behaviors that men might display. Combined with the evidence of physical abuse and her mother's disappearance, the picture that was emerging was one of a child living in a nightmare. When they arrived at school, Hank waited for the bus to empty before approaching Emily's seat. He'd decided to take a more direct approach, but he wanted to be careful not to frighten her further. "Emily," he said softly, "I want you to know that I know about your mom. I know she's missing and I know you're scared." Emily's eyes went wide, and for a moment, Hank thought she might bolt. But then, something in her expression changed, as if she'd been carrying this secret for so long that having someone acknowledge it was almost a relief. "I can't tell," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He said if I tell, something bad will happen." "Who said that, Emily? Who told you not to tell?" But Emily was already shaking her head, her brief moment of openness closing off again. "I can't," she repeated, standing up to leave. "I can't tell anyone." As she gathered her backpack, Hank noticed something that made his pulse quicken. As Emily stood up, something small and white fell from beneath her seat. Another photograph. This one showed a woman who looked like an older version of Emily, standing next to a man with dark hair and a mustache. But someone had torn the photograph in half, removing the man's face entirely. Emily saw the photograph at the same time Hank did, and her reaction was immediate and panicked. She lunged for it, but Hank was faster. As he picked up the torn photograph, he noticed something else. There were more pieces of paper under Emily's seat, as if she'd been hiding things there. "Emily, what are these?" he asked gently, but she was already backing away from him, her eyes wild with fear. "I have to go," she said, her voice shaking. "I have to go to class. I can't be late." She practically ran off the bus, leaving Hank standing there with the torn photograph in his hands. But now he knew where to look for more clues about what was happening to Emily Crawford. As soon as the bus was empty, Hank knelt down and looked under Emily's seat. What he found there made his blood run cold and confirmed his worst fears about what this little girl was going through. Hidden beneath the seat, carefully taped to the underside of the metal frame, was a small collection of items that told a story of terror and survival. There were more photographs, some torn and some intact, showing Jennifer Crawford at various stages of her life. There were several letters written in a child's handwriting that began with "Dear Mum" and described Emily's daily experiences and her hope that her mother would come back soon. But most disturbing of all was a small notebook, its pages filled with Emily's careful handwriting, documenting incidents that made Hank's hands shake as he read them. Dates, times, and descriptions of things that no child should ever have to endure, written in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to record evidence because she didn't know if anyone would believe her otherwise. The last entry, dated just 2 days ago, simply read, "He said Mom is never coming back. He said if I tell anyone what happens here, the same thing will happen to me. I'm scared. I don't know what to do." Hank carefully replaced everything exactly as he'd found it, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd discovered. Emily Crawford wasn't just a sad child. She was a child in immediate danger, living with someone who had likely harmed her mother and was now threatening her. As he drove the empty bus back to the depot, Hank knew he had reached a crossroads. He could no longer simply observe and worry. Emily Crawford needed help, and she needed it now, before whatever was happening to her got worse. The question was, how to help her, without putting her in even greater danger. Hank Peterson didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed next to his wife Margaret, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Emily Crawford's hidden notebook and the terror in her eyes when she'd begged him not to tell anyone. The entries he'd read haunted him. Descriptions of a man who alternated between fake kindness and frightening anger, who told Emily that her mother had gone away and would never come back, who made threats about what would happen if Emily told anyone about their special arrangement. Margaret had noticed his restlessness and had tried to talk to him about it, but Hank found himself unable to share the details of what he'd discovered. The notebook contained information that was too disturbing, too specific, and too dangerous to discuss casually. Instead, he'd simply told her that he was worried about a student and was trying to figure out how to help. "Sometimes," Margaret had said, her voice gentle in the darkness, "the best way to help someone is to trust the professionals who are trained to handle these situations. You can't save everyone, Hank, but you can make sure the right people know when someone needs saving." By morning, Hank had made his decision. He would contact the police, but he would also continue to monitor Emily's situation closely. The notebook she'd hidden under her seat suggested that she was keeping a record of her experiences, possibly as a way of maintaining some sense of control in a situation where she had none. He couldn't let her lose that coping mechanism, but he also couldn't let her continue to suffer. As he drove his morning route, Hank found himself paying attention to details he'd previously overlooked. The other children on his bus came from stable homes with predictable routines. They complained about normal things, homework, chores, younger siblings. They took for granted the safety and security that Emily Crawford had lost 3 months ago when her mother disappeared. When the bus arrived at Emily's stop, Hank was not surprised to see her emerge from around the corner of the White House, moving with the careful gait of someone who was in physical pain. Today, she was carrying a small paper bag in addition to her backpack, and she was glancing over her shoulder repeatedly as she approached the bus. "Morning, Emily," Hank said as she climbed aboard. "How are you feeling today?" She looked at him with those haunted brown eyes, and for a moment he thought she might actually answer, but then she simply nodded and made her way to her seat, clutching both her backpack and the paper bag with white-knuckled intensity. As the bus filled with other students, Hank found himself watching Emily more carefully than ever. She was exhibiting what his daughter Susan had called hypervigilance, constantly scanning her environment for threats, jumping at unexpected sounds, and positioning herself so she could see potential escape routes. It was the behavior of someone who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. About 10 minutes into the ride, something happened that made Hank's blood run cold. Emily had been sitting quietly as usual, when suddenly she stiffened and looked toward the back of the bus with an expression of pure terror. Following her gaze, Hank saw that she was staring at Tommy Rodriguez, who was innocently eating a breakfast sandwich his mother had packed for him. But Emily wasn't seeing Tommy. She was seeing something else entirely, something that the smell of food had triggered in her memory. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and she pressed herself against the window as if she was trying to disappear into the glass. Hank realized that Emily might be experiencing what professionals called a flashback, a trauma response, where past experiences felt like they were happening in the present moment. He'd heard about such things from his daughter Susan, who worked with trauma survivors in her job as a social worker. "Tommy," Hank called out gently, "could you save the rest of that sandwich for later? I'm smelling something that might be a problem with the bus engine." Tommy, who was a cooperative kid, immediately wrapped up his sandwich and put it away. Almost instantly, Emily's breathing began to normalize, and she stopped pressing herself against the window. It was a small intervention, but it confirmed Hank's growing understanding of how deeply Emily had been affected by whatever was happening to her. When they arrived at school, Hank waited for the bus to empty before approaching Emily's seat. He decided to take a more direct approach, but he wanted to be careful not to frighten her further. "Emily," he said softly, "I want you to know that I understand you're scared. I understand that someone has told you not to tell anyone what's happening, but I also want you to know that there are people who can help you, people who know how to keep you safe." Emily looked up at him, and for the first time she didn't immediately look away. "He said if I tell, something bad will happen," she whispered. "He said the same thing happened to Mom because she was going to tell." The words hit Hank like a physical blow. Emily wasn't just afraid of being hurt. She believed that her mother had been killed because she was going to report whatever was happening in that house. It explained so much. The terror, the secrecy, the way Emily carried her most precious possessions with her as if she might never see them again. "Emily, honey, what if I told you that there are ways to get help without anyone knowing it came from you? What if I told you that there are people whose job it is to investigate these kinds of situations quietly, without putting you in danger?" Emily's eyes widened, and Hank could see her processing this information. "You mean like police?" "Yes, like police, but special police who know how to handle situations like yours. People who are trained to help children who are in danger." For a moment, Emily looked hopeful, but then her expression closed off again and she shook her head. "He works at the hospital. He knows people. He said he has friends who would know if I talked to anyone." This new information sent a chill down Hank's spine. Robert Henley, the man who was supposedly caring for Emily, was using his position at the hospital to create a network of intimidation. He was making Emily believe that she had no escape, no safe place to turn. "Emily, I want you to listen to me very carefully," Hank said, crouching down so they were at eye level. "No one person has that much power. No one person knows everyone. There are people who can help you, people who are stronger than whoever is scaring you." Emily stared at him for a long moment, and Hank could see her weighing his words against the fear that had been drilled into her. Finally, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small piece of paper. "I wrote this down," she said, handing him the paper. "I wrote down everything I remember about the night Mom didn't come home. I thought maybe someday, if I was brave enough, I could give it to someone who could help." Hank took the paper with trembling hands. It was covered in Emily's careful handwriting, and as he read it, he felt his heart breaking. The account described a night 3 months ago when Emily had been staying with Robert Henley, while her mother worked a late shift at the hospital. Jennifer Crawford had called to say she was coming to pick up Emily, but she never arrived. Instead, Robert had told Emily that her mother had decided to go away and that Emily would be staying with him permanently. But Emily had also written about things she'd overheard, phone calls where Robert had talked about taking care of the problem and making sure she couldn't cause any more trouble. She'd written about finding her mother's purse hidden in Robert's basement and about the way he'd reacted when she'd asked about it. "Emily, this is very important information," Hank said, carefully folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. "You've been very brave to write this down, and you're being brave now by trusting me with it." Emily nodded, but tears were streaming down her face. "I miss my mom," she whispered. "I just want her to come back." "I know, honey. I know you do. And I'm going to do everything I can to help you find out what happened to her." As Emily gathered her things and prepared to leave the bus, Hank made a decision that would change everything. "Emily, I need you to do something for me. I need you to keep writing down anything unusual that happens, and I need you to keep hiding those papers under your seat on the bus. Can you do that?" Emily nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "You're not going to tell him, are you? You're not going to tell anyone at the hospital?" "No, Emily, I'm not going to tell anyone at the hospital. But I'm going to tell some people who can help you. People who know how to investigate these kinds of situations without putting you in danger." For the first time since he'd known her, Emily almost smiled. "Okay," she said. "I trust you." As she walked off the bus and toward the school building, Hank felt the weight of her trust settling on his shoulders. He had promised to help this child, and he knew that her life might depend on how well he kept that promise. It was time to call in the professionals. Detective Sarah Chen had been working child protection cases for 8 years, but she'd never received a call quite like the one that came in at 9:30 a.m. on a cold October morning. The caller was a school bus driver named Hank Peterson, and his voice was steady despite the disturbing information he was sharing. "I have a 12-year-old student named Emily Crawford, who I believe is being abused by the man who's supposed to be caring for her," Hank said without preamble. "Her mother disappeared 3 months ago, and Emily has been keeping a record of what's been happening to her. She's hidden it under her seat on my bus. Detective Chen had heard thousands of reports over the years, but something about this caller's tone made her sit up straighter. Tell me what you've observed, Mr. Peterson. For the next 20 minutes, Hank described everything he'd noticed. Emily's daily tears, her hypervigilance, the signs of physical abuse, and most importantly, the notebook and written account she'd hidden under her bus seat. He also shared what he'd learned about Jennifer Crawford's disappearance and Emily's fear that the same thing would happen to her if she told anyone what was happening. Mr. Peterson, I need you to understand that what you're describing suggests a very serious situation, Detective Chen said. If Emily Crawford is in immediate danger, we need to act quickly. But we also need to be careful not to make the situation worse. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Hank replied. Emily is terrified that Robert Henley will find out if she talks to anyone. She believes he has connections at the hospital where he works that would warn him if she reported anything. Detective Chen made notes as Hank spoke. She was already familiar with the Jennifer Crawford missing person case, though it had been assigned to a different detective. At the time, there had been no evidence of foul play, and the case had been treated as a voluntary missing person. But if Emily's account was accurate, Jennifer Crawford might have been murdered to prevent her from reporting abuse. Mr. Peterson, I'm going to need you to do something very important. I need you to continue your normal routine with Emily, but I want you to document everything you observe. Don't let her know that you've contacted us yet, but continue to be supportive and let her know she can trust you. What about the notebook under her seat? Should I leave it there? Yes, for now. We'll need to examine it eventually, but we want to make sure we don't do anything that might alert Robert Henley to our investigation. Can you tell me more about Emily's daily routine? When does she get on and off the bus? Does anyone ever meet her at the bus stop? Hank provided a detailed account of Emily's routine, including his observations about the house on Maple Street and the fact that Emily always appeared to be alone. He also shared his concern that Emily was carrying all her possessions with her, as if she was prepared to flee at any moment. After ending the call, Detective Chen immediately began making other calls. She contacted the detective who had handled Jennifer Crawford's missing person case and requested all the files. She also reached out to the Department of Children and Family Services to see if there had been any previous reports about Emily Crawford or Robert Henley. What she learned made her blood run cold. There had been no previous reports about Emily, but Robert Henley's name had come up in connection with another case 2 years earlier. A hospital employee had reported concerns about Henley's interactions with a female co-worker, but the woman had refused to cooperate with the investigation and the case had been closed. More disturbing was what Detective Chen learned about Jennifer Crawford's disappearance. The original investigating officer had noted that Jennifer's car had been found in the hospital parking lot, but her purse and personal belongings had never been located. At the time, this had been interpreted as evidence that she had left voluntarily. But if Emily had seen her mother's purse in Robert Henley's basement, it suggested something much more sinister. Detective Chen spent the rest of the morning researching Robert Henley. He was 45 years old, divorced, and had worked as a maintenance supervisor at Cedar Falls General Hospital for 8 years. He had no criminal record, but he'd been involved in several civil disputes with neighbors and former girlfriends. The pattern that emerged was one of a man who was controlling and manipulative, but who had never been charged with a crime. At 2:00 p.m., Detective Chen received another call from Hank Peterson. "I think something's happening," he said, his voice tight with worry. "Emily didn't get on the bus this afternoon. She's never missed school before, and she's never not been at her bus stop. Did you check with the school? Maybe she's sick?" I called them. They said she was in class all day until dismissal, but she never came to the bus loading area. The teacher said she just disappeared sometime between her last class and when the buses were called. Detective Chen felt her pulse quicken. "Mr. Peterson, I need you to drive by Emily's house and see if you can observe anything unusual. Don't stop, don't get out of your vehicle, just drive by and tell me what you see." "I'm already on my way there," Hank said. "I'll call you back in 10 minutes. While she waited for Hank's call, Detective Chen contacted her supervisor and requested immediate backup for what was potentially a child abduction case. She also reached out to the hospital to discreetly inquire about Robert Henley's work schedule and whether he had been at work that day. When Hank called back, his voice was shaking. "Detective, I think Emily might be in serious trouble. I drove by the house and all the curtains are drawn, but I could see shadows moving inside. There's also a different car in the driveway, Something that wasn't there this morning? What kind of car? It's a dark blue pickup truck, maybe 10 years old. The license plate starts with HBN, but I couldn't see the rest without being obvious about it. Detective Chen was already typing into her computer. Mr. Peterson, I need you to go back to the school and wait for me there. Don't go near the house again. We're going to handle this situation, but I need you to stay safe. What about Emily? What if something's happening to her right now? Mr. Peterson, I understand your concern, but we need to do this right. If we move too fast and alert Robert Henley, we could make the situation worse for Emily. We're going to get her help, but we need to be smart about it. As Detective Chen hung up the phone, she was already grabbing her jacket and calling for backup. The dark blue pickup truck was registered to Robert Henley, and according to the hospital, he had called in sick that morning. The same morning that Emily had failed to appear at her bus stop. The pieces were falling into place, and Detective Chen was beginning to understand that they were dealing with a much more dangerous situation than a simple child abuse case. If Robert Henley had killed Jennifer Crawford to prevent her from reporting abuse, and if he believed that Emily might expose him, then Emily Crawford was in immediate mortal danger. As Detective Chen drove towards Cedar Falls Elementary School, she prayed that they weren't already too late. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at Cedar Falls Elementary School to find Hank Peterson pacing in the parking lot beside his yellow school bus. The afternoon was grey and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that made everything seem ominous. Other buses were pulling away, loaded with children heading home to safe houses and normal lives, while Emily Crawford remained trapped in a nightmare that was about to reach its climax. Detective Chen. Hank approached her as she got out of her unmarked police car. I've been thinking about what we should do. Emily trusted me with that notebook, and she's been leaving clues under her bus seat. Maybe there's something else there that could help us. Show me, Detective Chen said, following Hank onto the bus. She had 2 backup units en route to the house on Maple Street, but she wanted to examine Emily's hiding place before they moved in. Sometimes the smallest detail could make the difference between a successful rescue and a tragedy. Hank led her to the 3rd seat on the right side and knelt down. It's all taped under here, he said, pointing to the underside of the metal seat frame. She's been hiding things for weeks. Detective Chen put on latex gloves and carefully examined the hidden cache. What she found was both heartbreaking and crucial to understanding what Emily had been enduring. In addition to the notebook and photographs that Hank had described, there were several new items. A small digital recorder that Emily had apparently been using to document conversations, a piece of paper with what looked like a floor plan of the house on Maple Street, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this. Detective, Hank said, his voice urgent, there's something else. Emily has been carrying that overstuffed backpack every day like she's ready to run. What if she's planning to try to escape on her own? The thought sent a chill through Detective Chen. A 12-year-old child attempting to flee from an adult who had already killed once would be putting herself in the greatest possible danger. Mr. Peterson, I need you to think carefully. Has Emily ever mentioned any specific places she might go? Any relatives, friends, anywhere she felt safe? Hank shook his head. According to what I read, her mother was all she had. But there was something she said about writing letters to her mom. Maybe she's been leaving them somewhere, like a place that was special to them. Detective Chen carefully removed the letter Emily had left for whoever finds this and read it quickly. The child's handwriting was shaky, as if she'd been writing in a hurry or under stress. If you're reading this, something bad happened to me like what happened to Mum. Robert Henley lives at 1247 Maple Street. He has Mum's purse in the basement behind the furnace. He told me he buried Mum in the woods behind the hospital, but I don't know if that's true. He said if I ever told anyone, he would make me disappear too. I tried to be good and not make him angry, but he gets angry anyway. Please tell someone what happened to us. Please don't let him hurt anyone else. Tell Mum I'm sorry I couldn't save her. Emily Crawford. The letter was dated that morning, which meant Emily had known something was going to happen. She'd prepared for the worst-case scenario and had left evidence that could convict her abuser even if she didn't survive. We need to move now, Detective Chen said, standing up quickly. Emily knew this morning that she was in danger. She might have tried to run, or Henley might have realized she was becoming a liability. Detective Chen's radio crackled to life. Detective, we're in position outside the house on Maple Street. The suspect's vehicle is in the driveway, but we haven't seen any movement. What are your orders? Stand by, Detective Chen replied. I'm en route to your location. Do not approach the house until I arrive. As they hurried off the bus, Hank grabbed Detective Chen's arm. Let me come with you. Emily trusts me. If she's scared and hiding, she might respond to my voice better than to strangers. Detective Chen started to refuse, but then she thought about the terrified child who had been documenting her abuse for weeks, who had trusted a bus driver with her most precious secrets. You'll stay in the car unless I specifically tell you otherwise. Understood. Understood. The drive to Maple Street took only 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Detective Chen's mind was racing through possible scenarios, most of them bad. If Robert Henley had realized that Emily was documenting his abuse, he might have decided to eliminate the evidence permanently. If Emily had tried to run, he might have panicked and done something irreversible. The house at 1247 Maple Street looked even more ominous in the grey afternoon light. The dark blue pickup truck was parked in the driveway, and every window was covered with heavy curtains or blinds. 2 police cars were positioned at either end of the block, their occupants watching the house carefully. Detective Chen parked across the street and radioed her backup units. I'm going to approach the front door. If I signal for assistance, move in immediately. We have reason to believe there's a child in immediate danger inside. As Detective Chen approached the house, she could hear sounds from inside. Muffled voices, the sound of something heavy being moved, and most chilling of all, the sound of a child crying. Her hand moved instinctively to her service weapon, but she forced herself to remain calm. The wrong move now could cost Emily her life. Detective Chen knocked on the front door, using the firm but non-threatening knock that she'd perfected over years of police work. Mr. Henley? This is Detective Chen with the Cedar Falls Police Department. I'd like to speak with you about Emily Crawford. The sounds from inside the house stopped immediately. For a long moment, there was complete silence and Detective Chen could feel her heart pounding. Then she heard footsteps approaching the door. What do you want? The voice was male, middle-aged, and carefully controlled. But Detective Chen could hear the tension underneath. Mr. Henley, I need to speak with you about Emily. Her school contacted us when she didn't show up for her bus this afternoon. We just want to make sure she's safe. Another long pause. She's fine. She's just not feeling well today. I understand, sir. But we need to see her to confirm that she's okay. It's standard procedure when a child doesn't show up at school. Detective Chen heard whispered voices from inside the house, as if Robert Henley was talking to someone, but she couldn't make out the words. What she could hear was the sound of a child crying, muffled as if someone was trying to keep her quiet. Mr. Henley, I can hear Emily crying. I need you to open the door so we can talk about what's happening. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Detective Chen was beginning to think she would need to force entry when she heard the sound of locks being turned. The door opened just a crack, and she could see a man's face in the narrow opening. She's upset because she's sick, Robert Henley said. She doesn't want to talk to strangers. But Detective Chen could see past him into the house, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Emily was sitting on a couch in the living room, her hands tied behind her back and tape over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was struggling against her restraints. Mr. Henley, I need you to step outside and talk to me, Detective Chen said, her hand moving to her weapon. And I need you to do it right now. But Robert Henley was already slamming the door shut. Detective Chen heard the sound of locks being engaged, and then she heard Emily's muffled screams getting louder. All units, move in now, Detective Chen shouted into her radio. We have a hostage situation. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Police officers surrounded the house, while Detective Chen tried to maintain communication with Robert Henley through the door. But the man had stopped responding, and the sounds from inside the house were becoming increasingly desperate. Finally, Detective Chen made the decision to breach the door. Using a tactical ram, 2 officers forced entry while Detective Chen provided cover. What they found inside was a scene that would haunt them for years to come. Emily was tied to a chair in the living room, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes defiant. Robert Henley was standing behind her with a knife, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Stay back," he shouted. "You don't understand what this little bitch has done. She's been lying about me, writing stories trying to get me in trouble." "Mr. Henley, put the knife down," Detective Chen said, her weapon trained on him. "Emily is a child. She's scared and she needs help. We can work this out, but you need to let her go." "You don't understand," Robert Henley said, his voice becoming increasingly unhinged. "She's just like her mother, always watching, always asking questions. Jennifer was going to ruin everything, and now Emily wants to do the same thing." "What happened to Jennifer, Mr. Henley? Where is Emily's mother?" For a moment, Robert Henley's expression changed, and Detective Chen saw something that might have been regret. "I didn't mean for that to happen," he said quietly. "Jennifer was going to report me to the hospital administration. She said I was inappropriate with her, that I made her uncomfortable. I couldn't let her destroy my career." "So you killed her?" "It was an accident. I just wanted to scare her, to make her understand that she needed to keep quiet. But she fought back and I—" He trailed off, his grip on the knife loosening slightly. Detective Chen saw her opportunity. "Mr. Henley, Emily is not responsible for her mother's death. She's just a child who misses her mum. Put the knife down and let us help you." But Robert Henley was shaking his head. "She knows too much. She's been writing everything down, recording conversations. She's going to destroy me just like her mother tried to do." "Emily is not going to destroy you, Mr. Henley. She's a scared little girl who needs help. We can get you help too, but you need to put the knife down." For a moment, Detective Chen thought he might comply, but then Emily made a small sound behind her tape, and Robert Henley's expression hardened again. "I can't go to prison," he said. "I won't survive in prison, and I can't let her testify against me." He raised the knife, and Detective Chen knew she was out of time. The moment Robert Henley raised the knife toward Emily, Detective Chen knew she had no choice. Her training kicked in, and she fired 2 shots in rapid succession, both hitting center mass. Henley dropped the knife and fell backward, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Emily's muffled screams filled the air as Detective Chen rushed to her side. The child was in shock, her eyes wide with terror, as she stared at the bleeding man who had held her captive for 3 months. Detective Chen quickly cut the rope, binding Emily's wrists, and gently removed the tape from her mouth. "It's okay, Emily," Detective Chen said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." Emily collapsed against Detective Chen, her small body shaking with sobs. "Is he dead?" she whispered. "Is he really dead?" Detective Chen looked over at Robert Henley, where paramedics were already working to stabilize him. He was alive, but barely. "He's hurt, but he's alive. And he's going to prison for what he did to you and your mother." "My mum," Emily said, looking up at Detective Chen with desperate hope. "He said he buried her in the woods behind the hospital. Is she really dead?" Detective Chen felt her heart break for this child who had endured so much. "Emily, we're going to find out what happened to your mother. I promise you that. But right now I need to make sure you're okay. Are you hurt? Did he hurt you today?" Emily shook her head. "He was angry because he found my notebook. He said he knew I was writing about him and he was going to make sure I couldn't tell anyone. He tied me up and said he was going to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "You don't have to say it," Detective Chen said gently. "You're safe now, and you were very brave to leave those clues for us. That notebook you hid under your bus seat helped us find you." Through the front window, Detective Chen could see Hank Peterson standing next to his bus, his face creased with worry. She signaled to one of the officers to let him know Emily was safe. When Emily saw Hank through the window, she managed a small smile. "Mr. Hank," she said, "he was the only one who believed me. He was the only one who listened when I was scared." "Mr. Peterson is a hero," Detective Chen said. "He's the reason we found you in time." As the paramedics worked on Robert Henley, Detective Chen heard him mumbling incoherently. She moved closer to listen, hoping he might confess to what he'd done with Jennifer Crawford's body. What she heard made her blood run cold. "There are others," he was saying. "In the basement, behind the furnace. I couldn't let them talk. I couldn't let them ruin everything." Detective Chen immediately radioed for additional units and a forensics team. If Robert Henley had killed other women besides Jennifer Crawford, they needed to search the house thoroughly. She also called for a specialized team trained in excavating potential burial sites. While they waited for backup, Detective Chen stayed with Emily, who was still shaking from her ordeal. The child had been through more trauma than most adults could handle, but she was showing remarkable resilience. "Emily, I need to ask you some questions about what happened here, but I want you to know that you're safe now. No one is going to hurt you anymore." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I wrote everything down. I wrote about the night Mom didn't come home and about the things he did to me after that. I hid it all under my seat on the bus because I was afraid he would find it if I kept it at home." "That was very smart, Emily. Those notes are going to help us make sure Robert Henley goes to prison for a long time." Emily looked around the house that had been her prison for 3 months. "I hated this place. He made me sleep in the basement, and sometimes I could hear him talking to someone upstairs, but when I asked who it was, he said it was none of my business." Detective Chen felt a chill run down her spine. Emily, did you ever see anyone else in the house? Any other women or children? Emily shook her head. No, but sometimes I heard crying. Late at night I would hear someone crying, but it wasn't me. When I asked him about it, he got really angry and said I was imagining things. The forensics team arrived just as Robert Henley was being loaded into an ambulance. Detective Chen briefed them on what she'd heard about other potential victims, and they immediately began setting up equipment to search the basement and yard. Detective Chen, Emily said quietly, there's something else. In the basement behind the furnace there's a loose brick. Robert put things there that he didn't want anyone to find. Detective Chen immediately relayed this information to the forensics team. Within an hour they had found a small cavity behind the furnace that contained several items: jewelry, identification cards and personal belongings from multiple women, including Jennifer Crawford's purse and driver's license. As the investigation continued, the full scope of Robert Henley's crimes began to emerge. He had been targeting vulnerable women for years, using his position at the hospital to gain their trust before isolating and eventually killing them. Jennifer Crawford had been his latest victim, but she had fought back and threatened to expose him, which had led to her murder. Emily had been kept alive because Henley had convinced himself that he could control her, that she was young enough to be molded into the compliant companion he desperately wanted. But Emily's intelligence and courage had foiled his plans. By documenting his abuse and leaving clues for others to find, she had ensured that his crimes would eventually be exposed. As the sun set over Cedar Falls, Emily Crawford was taken to the hospital for a medical evaluation. She was physically bruised and emotionally traumatized, but she was alive. The nightmare that had begun 3 months ago with her mother's disappearance was finally over. Detective Chen stayed with Emily throughout the medical examination, knowing that the child needed someone she trusted nearby. When they were finally alone, Emily asked the question that had been haunting her for months. Detective Chen, will you help me find my mum? I know she's probably dead, but I need to know what happened to her. I need to be able to say goodbye. Yes, Emily. I promise we'll find your mother and bring her home. Robert Henley is going to tell us everything he did, and we're going to make sure your mother gets the funeral she deserves. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. I tried to save her. I tried to be good so he wouldn't hurt me like he hurt her, but I couldn't save her. Emily, listen to me very carefully. What happened to your mother was not your fault. You were a child and you couldn't have stopped what happened, but you did something incredibly brave. You survived, and you made sure that Robert Henley would be caught. You saved yourself, and you probably saved other children who might have been hurt in the future. For the first time in months, Emily Crawford smiled. It was a small smile, fragile and uncertain, but it was real. She had been through hell, but she had survived, and now with the help of people who cared about her, she could begin to heal. As Detective Chen drove Emily to a safe house where she would stay while arrangements were made for her long-term care, she reflected on the courage of this remarkable child. Emily had faced unimaginable terror and had found the strength to document her abuse, to leave clues for others to find, and to trust a bus driver who had shown her kindness. The investigation would continue for weeks, but the most important part was over. Emily Crawford was safe and Robert Henley would spend the rest of his life in prison. It wasn't enough to bring back Jennifer Crawford or the other women he had killed, but it was justice. And sometimes, Detective Chen thought, as she watched Emily sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat, justice was enough. 3 weeks after Emily Crawford's rescue, Detective Sarah Chen stood in the woods behind Cedar Falls General Hospital, watching as a forensics team carefully excavated what appeared to be a shallow grave. The information had come from Robert Henley himself, who had finally confessed to the murders of 5 women over the past 4 years, including Jennifer Crawford. Henley had survived his gunshot wounds and was now in custody, facing multiple charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and child abuse. During his interrogation, he had revealed the locations of his victims' bodies with the detached precision of someone who had completely detached from the reality of his crimes. Detective Chen, Dr. Patricia Walsh, the medical examiner, approached with a grim expression. We've found her. The dental records confirm it's Jennifer Crawford. Detective Chen felt a mixture of relief and sadness. They had found Emily's mother, which meant the child could finally have closure. But it also meant that Emily's worst fears had been confirmed. Her mother had been murdered by the man who had then held Emily captive for 3 months. How did she die? Detective Chen asked. though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Blunt force trauma to the head. It appears she was struck multiple times with a heavy object, probably a hammer or similar tool. Based on the positioning of the remains and the evidence we found at Henley's house, I believe she was killed in his basement and then buried here. Detective Chen closed her eyes, thinking about the brave 12-year-old who had survived 3 months with her mother's killer. Emily had suspected that her mother was dead, but hearing it confirmed would still be devastating. There's something else, Dr. Walsh continued. We found evidence that Jennifer Crawford fought back. There's damage to her hands and arms consistent with defensive wounds, and we found skin cells under her fingernails that match Robert Henley's DNA. This information was crucial for the prosecution's case, but it also painted a picture of Jennifer Crawford's final moments that was both heartbreaking and heroic. She had fought to survive, possibly knowing that her daughter needed her. In the end, she had lost that fight, but her courage had been passed down to Emily. As the forensics team continued their work, Detective Chen received a call from the social worker who had been assigned to Emily's case. The child was staying with a foster family in Minneapolis, but she had been asking daily about the search for her mother's body. Detective Chen, Emily wants to know if you found her mother yet. She's been having nightmares about not being able to say goodbye properly. I think she needs to know whatever the outcome. Detective Chen looked at the gravesite where Jennifer Crawford's remains were being carefully documented and prepared for transport. We found her, she said simply. Tell Emily we found her mother and that she's coming home. The drive to Minneapolis took 2 hours, and Detective Chen spent the time thinking about how to tell a traumatized child that her mother was indeed dead. Emily had suspected it, had even written about it in her hidden notebook, but confirmation was always different from speculation. Emily was staying with the Morrison family, experienced foster parents who specialized in caring for children who had experienced severe trauma. When Detective Chen arrived, she found Emily sitting in the living room, working on a puzzle. The child looked better than she had 3 weeks ago. She had gained a little weight, her hair had been properly cut, and she was wearing clean clothes that actually fit. But Detective Chen could see the sadness in her eyes that would probably never completely go away. Emily, I have news about your mother, Detective Chen said gently, sitting down beside her on the couch. Emily looked up with hopeful eyes. Did you find her? Yes, honey, we found her. She's been buried in the woods behind the hospital where she worked. We're bringing her home now. Emily's face crumpled, and she began to cry with the deep, wrenching sobs of a child who had been holding on to hope, despite knowing the truth. Detective Chen held her while she cried, offering what comfort she could. I knew she was dead, Emily whispered through her tears. I knew Robert killed her, but I kept hoping maybe she was just hiding somewhere, waiting for it to be safe to come back. Emily, your mother loved you very much. She fought very hard to try to get back to you. The reason Robert killed her was because she was going to report him to the police for the way he had been treating her at work. She was trying to protect herself and other women, but she was also trying to protect you. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Can I see her? Can I go to her funeral? Of course, we'll make sure you can say goodbye to your mother properly. And Emily, there's something else. We found a letter in your mother's purse that she had written to you. She must have written it the night before she died. Detective Chen pulled out a sealed envelope that had been among Jennifer Crawford's personal effects. Emily's name was written on the front in her mother's handwriting. With trembling hands, Emily opened the letter and read it silently. As she read, fresh tears began to flow, but Detective Chen could see that these were different tears, tears of love and connection rather than just grief. What did she say? Detective Chen asked gently. Emily looked up with a watery smile. She said she loved me more than anything in the world. She said if anything ever happened to her, I should remember that she fought to stay with me. And she said I was the strongest, bravest girl she knew, and that I could survive anything. Your mother was right, Emily. You are incredibly strong and brave. You survived 3 months with someone who hurt you, and you were smart enough to leave clues that helped us find you. Your mother would be so proud of you. Emily carefully folded the letter and held it against her chest. Detective Chen, what's going to happen to me now? I don't have any family left. The social worker and I have been working on that. There's a couple in Cedar Falls who have been following your story. They've asked if they can meet you, and if you like each other, they'd like to adopt you. They're good people, Emily. They have a daughter who's a little older than you, and they want to give you a real home. Emily's eyes widened with hope. Really? They want to adopt me? Really? Their names are David and Susan Martinez. David is a teacher at the high school, and Susan is a nurse. They've been married for 15 years and they've been wanting to adopt a child for a long time. When they read about what happened to you, they knew they wanted to help. Can I meet them? Of course, they're coming to visit you next week. If you feel comfortable with them, you can start spending weekends at their house. If everything goes well, you can move in with them permanently. For the first time since Detective Chen had known her, Emily looked truly hopeful. Will I still be able to visit my mum's grave? Absolutely. The Martinez family lives in Cedar Falls, so you'll be close to where your mother is buried. You can visit her whenever you want. Emily nodded, clutching her mother's letter. Detective Chen, will you come to my mum's funeral? I'll be there, Emily, I promise. As Detective Chen prepared to leave, Emily asked one more question. What's going to happen to Robert Henley? He's going to prison for the rest of his life. He confessed to killing your mother and 4 other women. He'll never be able to hurt anyone else again. Emily was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Good, she said finally. I'm glad he can't hurt anyone else, but I'm not glad he's going to die in prison. I'm glad he's going to have to live with what he did. Detective Chen was struck by the maturity and wisdom in Emily's words. This child had been through hell, but she had emerged with her compassion and sense of justice intact. She was going to be okay. As Detective Chen drove back to Cedar Falls, she reflected on the case that had changed her life. She had seen a lot of terrible things in her career, but she had also seen the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Emily Crawford had survived the worst kind of trauma and had emerged stronger, braver, and more compassionate than many adults. The investigation was finally over, but Emily's story was just beginning. She had a new family waiting for her, a chance to heal from her trauma, and the knowledge that her mother had loved her enough to fight for her life. It wasn't the ending that anyone would have chosen, but it was a new beginning. And sometimes, Detective Chen thought as she watched the sun set over the Minnesota countryside, a new beginning was all anyone could ask for. 6 months after the rescue, Emily Crawford stood in the kitchen of her new home, carefully arranging flowers in a vase. Tomorrow was her 13th birthday, and it would be the first birthday she had celebrated since her mother's death. The Martinez family had planned a small party with cake and presents, but Emily had only one request. She wanted to visit her mother's grave first. Emily, do you need any help with those flowers? Susan Martinez asked, entering the kitchen with a warm smile. Over the past few months, Susan had become the closest thing to a mother that Emily had known since Jennifer Crawford's death. I think I'm okay, Emily said, adjusting a yellow rose. I just want them to be perfect for Mom. Susan nodded, understanding. Emily visited her mother's grave every weekend, always bringing fresh flowers and sometimes sitting for hours, talking to the headstone as if her mother could hear her. The therapist had said this was a healthy way for Emily to process her grief and maintain a connection to her mother's memory. Are you excited about your party tomorrow? Susan asked, sitting down at the kitchen table where Emily had been working. Emily nodded, a genuine smile crossing her face. I never thought I'd be excited about anything again, but living here, with you and David and Maria, it feels like I'm allowed to be happy again. Maria Martinez, who was 15 and had welcomed Emily into the family like a true sister, bounded into the kitchen. Emily, do you want to help me make the playlist for your party? I have all the songs you like. Sure, Emily said, finishing with the flowers. But first, I want to write in my journal. Emily had been keeping a journal since shortly after moving in with the Martinez family. But this journal was different from the notebook she had hidden under her bus seat. This journal was about healing, about documenting her recovery and her new life rather than the trauma she had endured. As Emily went upstairs to her room, she passed the hallway where her school pictures were displayed alongside those of Maria. It was a small thing, but it meant everything to Emily to see her face included in the family photos. She had a place here, a real home. Her bedroom was painted in soft blue and white, with a window that looked out over the backyard, where David Martinez had built a small garden. Emily had planted flowers there in memory of her mother, and she tended them carefully. The garden was thriving just as Emily was beginning to thrive. Emily sat at her desk and opened her journal to a fresh page. She had developed a routine of writing about her day, her feelings, and her hopes for the future. The therapist had said it was a way of taking control of her narrative, of writing a new story to replace the one that had been written for her during those terrible months with Robert Henley. Dear Journal, she wrote, tomorrow is my 13th birthday. I can't believe it's been 6 months since Detective Chen found me. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. I still have nightmares sometimes, but they're getting less frequent. Susan says that's normal, that healing takes time. Emily paused, thinking about how much her life had changed. She was attending Cedar Falls Middle School now, where she had made several friends. Her teachers knew about her background, but they treated her like any other student. She was even thinking about joining the school newspaper, where she could use her writing skills in a positive way. I saw Mr. Hank today, she continued writing. He still drives the bus and he always waves when he sees me. I think he might cry every time he sees me, but he tries to hide it. I want to do something special for him because he saved my life. Maybe I'll write him a letter telling him how much he means to me. Emily closed her journal and looked out her window at the garden. The flowers were blooming beautifully, and she could see David Martinez working in his workshop, building something that looked like a birdhouse. This was what a normal family looked like, she realized. People who cared about each other, who worked together to create something beautiful. Downstairs, the phone rang and Emily heard Susan answer it. A few minutes later, Susan called upstairs. Emily, it's Detective Chen. She wants to wish you a happy birthday. Emily hurried downstairs and took the phone. Detective Chen had become an important figure in her life, someone who understood what she had been through and who had promised to always be there if Emily needed her. Happy birthday, Emily, Detective Chen said warmly. How are you feeling about turning 13? I feel good, Emily said, surprised to realize that she meant it. I feel like I'm really living again, not just surviving. That's wonderful to hear. I have some news I thought you might want to know. Robert Henley was sentenced yesterday. He received 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He'll never be able to hurt anyone else again. Emily felt a sense of closure wash over her. Good, she said. I'm glad he can't hurt anyone else, but I'm also glad that I don't have to think about him anymore. I want to focus on my new life. That's exactly what you should do, Detective Chen said. You have a bright future ahead of you, Emily. Your mother would be so proud of the young woman you're becoming. After ending the call, Emily went back to her room and pulled out a special box she kept under her bed. Inside were the photographs of her mother that she had hidden on the school bus, along with the letter her mother had written to her. She also kept copies of the journal entries she had written during those dark months, not because she wanted to remember the trauma, but because she wanted to remember her own strength. At the bottom of the box was a newer item, a letter from a publishing company. Emily had written an essay about her experience for a national contest on youth resilience, and she had won first place. The essay would be published in a magazine that reached millions of readers, and Emily hoped it might help other children who were going through similar experiences. The essay was titled Finding My Voice, and it described how she had learned to document her experiences as a way of maintaining hope and fighting back against someone who wanted to silence her. She had written about the importance of trusted adults who listen to children, about the power of leaving clues for others to find, and about the strength that came from refusing to give up. Every child deserves to feel safe, the essay concluded. Every child deserves to have someone who will listen when they're scared. I was lucky to have Mr. Hank, who saw my tears and decided to help. I was lucky to have Detective Chen, who believed my story and acted quickly to save me. But not every child has someone like that in their life. We need to be those people for each other. We need to pay attention, to listen, and to act when we see someone who needs help. Emily put the letter back in the box and closed it. Tomorrow, she would celebrate her 13th birthday with her new family. She would visit her mother's grave and tell her about the essay, about the new friends she had made, about the garden that was blooming in her memory. She would tell her mother that she was okay, that she was healing, and that she was going to use her experience to help other children. As Emily got ready for bed, she thought about the future. She wanted to become a writer to tell stories that mattered and to help people who were going through difficult times. She wanted to work with children who had experienced trauma, to show them that survival was possible and that healing was real. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were balanced now by dreams of the future. Dreams of college, of a career helping others, of a life filled with purpose and meaning, dreams that her mother would have been proud of. Emily turned off the light and settled into bed, feeling safe and loved in a way she had never expected to feel again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new reasons to be grateful for the second chance she had been given. As she drifted off to sleep, Emily whispered a quiet thank you to her mother, to Detective Chen, to Mr. Hank, and to the Martinez family who had opened their hearts to her. She had learned that even in the darkest moments, there were people who cared enough to help, and she had learned that surviving was just the beginning. The real victory was in learning to thrive. The little girl who had cried silently on the school bus was gone, replaced by a young woman who had found her voice and was determined to use it to make the world a better place. Emily Crawford's story was no longer about survival. It was about hope, healing, and the power of human kindness to transform even the most broken lives. And in the morning, she would wake up ready to celebrate not just her birthday, but the incredible journey that had brought her home. Epilogue. 5 years later, Emily Crawford Martinez stood at the podium of the Cedar Falls Community Center, looking out at an audience of social workers, teachers, police officers, and community members. She was 18 now, about to graduate from high school, and she had been invited to speak at a conference on child protection and trauma recovery. "My name is Emily Crawford Martinez," she began, her voice clear and strong, "and I'm here to tell you about the power of paying attention to the children in your care." In the audience, she could see Detective Chen, who had become a friend and mentor over the years. She could see Mr. Hank, who had retired from bus driving but still volunteered at the school. She could see David and Susan Martinez, who had legally adopted her and given her a family name to be proud of. "5 years ago, I was a 12-year-old girl who cried every morning on the school bus," Emily continued. "I was trapped in a nightmare, convinced that no one would believe me if I told them what was happening, but there was a bus driver who noticed my tears and decided to do something about it. There was a detective who listened to his concerns and acted quickly to save my life. There was a family who opened their hearts to a damaged child and showed me what love looked like." Emily paused, looking out at the audience. "I'm not here to tell you that recovery is easy or that trauma doesn't leave scars. I still have difficult days. I still sometimes wake up from nightmares. But I'm here to tell you that healing is possible, that children are more resilient than we think, and that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything." She held up a copy of her first published book, a memoir about her experience that had become a bestseller and was being used in training programs for social workers and law enforcement officers across the country. This book exists because people cared enough to save a crying child on a school bus. It exists because someone noticed that something was wrong and decided to do something about it. I hope that by sharing my story, I can help other children who are going through what I went through. I hope I can help the adults in their lives recognize the signs and act on them. Emily looked out at the audience one more time, seeing faces that reflected hope, determination, and compassion. "Thank you for everything you do to protect children. Thank you for being willing to listen when they need to be heard. And thank you for believing that every child deserves to be safe." As applause filled the room, Emily smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had survived the worst that life could throw at her, and she had emerged stronger, more compassionate, and more determined than ever to make a difference in the world. The little girl who had hidden her treasures under a bus seat had grown into a young woman who was changing the world, one story at a time, and she was just getting started.